He didn't walk into that courtroom. He arrived. Damiano Valenti moved through the federal courthouse like a man who had never once been told no. Not by a judge, not by a senator, not by anyone who valued their continued existence. His suit probably cost more than Serena Belandi's monthly rent. His lawyers flanked him like a private army. And when he sat down at the defense table, he looked around the room with the kind of slow, unhurried calm that made seasoned federal prosecutors shift in their chairs. Serena had translated for cartel lieutenants, human traffickers, a sitting alderman who cried through his entire deposition. She had learned over 11 years of federal court interpretation how to feel absolutely nothing. But something about the way Damiano Valenti scanned that room, not nervous, not performing, just cataloging, made her hands tighten around her notepad. She told herself it was professionalism, alertness. She was wrong. And in about 4 hours, one whispered sentence in a nearly dead dialect was going to change everything she thought she knew about staying invisible. Before we go any further, if stories like this are your thing, stories with real tension, complicated people, and moments that make you hold your breath, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. We release new stories every week, and I promise you will not want to miss what's coming. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to that courtroom. The thing Serena hated most about high-profile federal hearings wasn't the hours. It wasn't the fluorescent lights that hummed at a frequency specifically engineered, she was convinced, to give interpreters migraines by noon. It wasn't even the lawyers, though God knows some of them deserved a category of their own. It was the silence between words. The moment after a question landed and before anyone answered, when every person in the room was calculating, what can I say? What can I afford to give away? What will this cost me later? Serena lived in those silences. She translated the words on either side of them, but the silences were the actual conversation, and 11 years had made her fluent in those too. She'd arrived that morning at 7:42, 18 minutes before she needed to, because she was always early. Her navy blazer was pressed. Her hair was pinned back the way her grandmother used to do it. Not elegantly, just practically. 2 pins and done. She had her notepad, her 2 backup pens, the small thermos of espresso her neighbor Mrs. Colucci had pressed into her hands that morning with the words, "You look tired, Bambina. Drink this before you walk in there and embarrass us all." Mrs. Colucci was 81 and still thought Serena was 25. Which was either touching or insulting depending on the day. She found her seat at the interpreter's station, a small desk angled so she could see both the witness stand and the defense table simultaneously, and she opened her notepad to a fresh page. She wrote the date. She wrote the case number. She uncapped her pen. She did not look up when the courtroom began to fill. She'd learned that looking up too early was how you got pulled into the human drama before the proceeding even started. And human drama was the enemy of clean translation. You had to stay above it. You had to be the glass between the fish tank and the observer, present, transparent, not in the water. So she was writing a note to herself about a verb conjugation she wanted to verify before the afternoon session when she heard it. Not words. Not yet. Just a shift in the room's atmosphere. The kind of shift that happens when a storm front moves in, when the air pressure changes before a single drop of rain falls. The background murmur of lawyers and clerks and bailiffs didn't stop exactly, but it organized itself somehow, the way a school of fish moves when something large enters the water. Serena looked up. Damiano Valenti was 43 years old, according to the case file she'd reviewed the night before. The file had described him as a suspected organized crime figure with alleged ties to Sicilian and Calabrian criminal networks operating across the eastern seaboard. It had included a photograph that looked like it had been taken from surveillance footage, grainy, slightly blurred, the kind of image that made everyone look vaguely criminal. The photograph had not prepared her for the actual man. He wasn't the largest person in the room. He wasn't loud. He wasn't performing the way some of them did. The defendants who came in with too much cologne and practiced smiles, trying to project innocence from the moment they crossed the threshold. Damiano Valenti walked into the courtroom like a man who had decided, some years ago, that he didn't need to perform anything for anyone. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that was simple enough to look almost understated until you noticed how it fit, which was perfectly. Not in a showy way. Just in the way that said someone had paid attention to every detail and then deliberately made it look effortless. His hair was dark with the first threads of silver at the temples. He had the kind of face that looked like it had been through things. Not ugly, not Hollywood handsome, just settled, like a landscape after a long winter. He sat down at the defense table. One of his lawyers leaned in immediately, whispering something urgent. Damiano didn't lean in to hear it. He just tilted his head barely a degree in a way that said, "I heard you. I'll deal with it when I choose to." Then he looked directly at the interpreter's station. At her. Serena had been looked at by defendants before, sometimes with contempt, sometimes with the flat evaluation of someone deciding whether you were a threat. Once, memorably, with the kind of unhinged desperation that had made her request a security escort to her car afterward. This was none of those things. Damiano Valenti looked at her the way someone looks at a painting they've passed 100 times and are only now actually seeing. Not aggressive, not appraising exactly, just present, like he was actually paying attention. Serena looked back down at her notepad. "Stop it," she told herself. "He's a defendant. You're a translator. You're the glass. Remember the glass." The hearing began at 9:15, delayed by a procedural argument between the lead prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Marcus Webb, and Damiano's senior defense counsel about the admissibility of certain financial documents. Serena translated the portions that required Italian, a handful of phrases from the documents in question, 2 exchanges between Damiano and his attorneys, that protocol required her to interpret even though the defendant himself clearly had no trouble following the English proceedings. That was the first thing she noticed. He understood everything. Not in the way of someone with good English who was following along, in the way of someone who was operating 3 steps ahead in every language being spoken. When Webb said something pointed about offshore accounts, Damiano's expression didn't change, but she watched his right hand resting on the table and the index finger moved. One small tap, like he was mentally filing something away. The morning session ran long. By 11:30, the fluorescent lights were doing their thing, and Serena had translated 14 exhibits, 1 extended argument between co-counsel, and a surprisingly heated sidebar that she'd rendered into Italian for the record, even though nobody on the Italian side of the table had requested it, because protocol was protocol. She was exhausted in the specific way that fine detail work produces. Not physically drained, just mentally hollowed out, like someone had taken a small spoon and carefully excavated every last reserve of focus she had. The lunch break came at 12:40, and the bailiff announced a 90-minute recess. Most people stood and stretched immediately. Lawyers clustered. The court reporter flexed her fingers. A junior prosecutor knocked over a water glass and spent a frantic 30 seconds mopping it up with his sleeve, while his colleague pretended not to notice. Serena stayed in her seat. She was reviewing a phrase from the morning session, a regional term in the financial documents that had 2 possible translations with meaningfully different legal implications, and she wanted to make sure she'd rendered it correctly. She had, but she checked anyway because she always checked anyway. She was in the middle of writing herself a note about it when she became aware that the defense table had not entirely cleared. Damiano Valenti was still there. His lawyers had gone, presumably to confer somewhere private about whatever catastrophe was developing in the admissibility dispute. The 2 security men who'd flanked him during the session had stepped back to the wall. Damiano himself was sitting with a folder open in front of him, but he wasn't reading it. He was watching her check her notes. Serena kept writing. She finished the note. She capped her pen. She reviewed what she'd written. It was only when she reached for her thermos that she registered how quiet the room had gotten. Most of the gallery had filtered out. The court reporter was gone. The clerks were gone. The junior prosecutor was still trying to get the water stain out of his sleeve in the hallway. It was just Serena, Damiano, and his 2 security men standing at the far wall pretending very hard to be pieces of furniture. She poured her espresso. She told herself she wasn't going to look at him again. She thought about the phrase from the financial documents, and a different version of it surfaced in the back of her mind. Not from the legal transcripts, but from her grandmother's kitchen, 20 years gone. The word had been used differently there. As an insult, actually. A very specific kind of insult for a certain kind of man. A man who sat in important rooms expecting the room to arrange itself around him. She didn't mean to say it out loud. She would later tell herself, honestly, genuinely, that she thought she was alone, that the words just surfaced because she was tired and her filter was down and the room was empty and the espresso hadn't hit yet. In the soft, layered Sicilian dialect her grandmother had spoken. Not Italian, not the standardized version, but the real thing, the one that had roots going back centuries and that she'd estimated fewer than 40,000 people in the world still understood fluently. She murmured, Principu arroganti senza regnu. Arrogant prince without a kingdom. The words were barely a breath. She wasn't even sure she'd said them aloud rather than just thinking them. She picked up her espresso. She looked back down at her notes. The silence that followed was different from the silence that had been there before. It had texture now. Serena looked up slowly. Damiano Valenti had turned in his chair. Not dramatically. He hadn't spun around or stood up or done anything that could be called a reaction. He had simply rotated slightly, in the unhurried way he seemed to do everything, and was now looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not anger, not offense. Amusement. The kind of amusement that isn't performed for an audience, that doesn't need anyone else to witness it, that lives entirely in the corners of the eyes before it reaches the mouth. One side of his expression shifted, the ghost of something that wasn't quite a smile but was definitely headed in that direction. He let the silence sit for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then, in Sicilian, clean, native, with an accent that placed him specifically in the western provinces, not far from where her grandmother had grown up, he said, Dilla ancora principessa. Say it again, princess. The espresso cup stopped halfway to her mouth. Serena Belandi had spent 11 years making herself invisible in rooms like this one. She was the glass. She was the conduit. She was the professional non-presence that allowed other people's words to travel from one language to another without interference or opinion or personality. She had, in the last 45 seconds, insulted a federal defendant in a regional Sicilian dialect she had genuinely believed almost nobody spoke anymore, in a federal courthouse, during a recess, with his security team standing 12 feet away. The espresso cup made it the rest of the way to her mouth because her hands were not going to shake. She had decided this. She set it back down. She looked at Damiano Valenti with the same expression she'd used on the alderman who cried, composed, present, professionally neutral. I apologize, she said, in careful standard Italian. That was inappropriate. Damiano's expression didn't shift. You didn't answer in Sicilian. No. That's interesting. It was an automatic correction to a more appropriate register, she said, which was true and also a lie, because the real reason was that her grandmother's dialect in Damiano Valenti's mouth had done something strange to her chest that she didn't have language for yet and absolutely did not want to examine while he was looking at her. He tilted his head. Not the barely a degree tilt from the morning. This was a real one, curious and evaluating. Where did you learn it? My grandmother. She met his eyes, because looking away now would be a form of retreat she wasn't willing to perform. She was from Palermo, Western Province. So was my mother. That landed somewhere she hadn't expected. One of his security men shifted slightly. Damiano glanced at him once, briefly, and the man became furniture again. You've been careful all morning, Damiano said. His Italian had switched back to the standard variety, neutral and clean. Every translation, I was watching. That's my job. You caught the Settimana variant on the third document. Most people wouldn't have. She hadn't expected him to know what that was. I checked my work, she said. I noticed. He closed the folder on the table, not casually, deliberately, like a door closing. You're going to be in this hearing for how long? That's not information I'm at liberty to... Weeks, he said. They've got enough material for at least 6 weeks of proceedings. He said it like he was discussing the weather. 6 weeks is a long time to spend in a room with someone you've called an arrogant prince. Serena kept her expression steady. It was unprofessional. It won't happen again. Damiano looked at her for a long moment. The amusement was still there, quiet and settled, like it had taken up permanent residence. I'm not offended. he said. I'm aware. Are you? She picked up her notepad. I have work to review before the afternoon session, Mr. Valenti. He stood up. Not quickly. Damiano Valenti appeared to do nothing quickly, as if he'd decided years ago that hurrying was something he simply didn't do anymore. He straightened his jacket, unhurried, and picked up the folder. Your grandmother taught you well, he said. That dialect is nearly gone. Most people your age can't hold a full sentence in it. She didn't answer. Pity, he said, almost to himself, and walked toward the door where his lawyers were waiting, and the two security men fell in behind him without being asked. Serena sat very still for a moment after the door closed. Then she looked down at her notepad. Principu arroganti senza regnu. Her grandmother had used that phrase exactly once, that Serena could remember, for the landlord who'd raised her rent during a bad harvest year and then complained about the slow payment with the specific moral confidence of a man who had never once been poor. She had not expected to use it in a federal courthouse in Chicago. She had not expected anyone to understand it. She had especially not expected the man it was aimed at to smile. She recapped her pen. She straightened her notepad. She poured the last of the espresso and drank it while it was still warm. He's a defendant, she reminded herself. You're the glass. That's all. But the glass, for the first time in 11 years, had a hairline crack running through it, and the afternoon session hadn't even started. When the hearing resumed at 2:15, Damiano Valenti took his seat at the defense table and did not look at the interpreter's station. He didn't need to. Serena translated 17 exhibits over the next 3 hours. She rendered questions and answers from Italian to English and back with the precision that had made her, according to 3 separate judicial commendations she kept in a drawer at home because displaying them felt like bragging, one of the most reliable federal interpreters in the Northern District of Illinois. She did not make a single error. She also became gradually uncomfortably aware that Damiano Valenti was, with extraordinary subtlety, monitoring every translation she made, not checking her, not challenging her, just tracking her. The same way he'd tracked the room that morning. She would render a phrase, and she would see at the edge of her vision something in his posture confirm or register what she'd said. Not a response to the legal content, a response to her choices. He was listening to how she translated, not just what she translated. It was the most unsettling thing that had happened to her in 11 years of federal court work, which was saying something, because she'd once translated for a man who was simultaneously texting his girlfriend and his alibi witness from the defense table. By 5 o'clock, her neck ached and her notepad was full, and the lead prosecutor had announced they'd return the following morning for the continuation of document review. People began gathering their things. Serena was pulling on her coat when the senior clerk, a gray-haired veteran named Ron, who'd been at the courthouse longer than most of the judges, appeared at her elbow with an expression that said he was about to deliver news she wasn't going to enjoy. Got a reassignment notice for you, he said. Came through this afternoon from the federal marshal's office. She took the envelope. She read it once, read it again. Effective immediately due to her rare documented proficiency in regional Sicilian dialects and her existing case clearance, she was being reassigned as exclusive interpreter for the confidential cooperation proceedings in the matter of United States versus Valenti. Not the public hearing, the cooperation agreement. The private sessions between Damiano Valenti and the federal prosecutors who were apparently negotiating something that required a translator who could follow every layer of the conversation. She stood in the emptying courtroom, holding the envelope and thinking about hairline cracks in glass. Ron was still there. You okay? Fine, she said. It's a big case. Yes. The marshal's office says it starts tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. He paused. Different room. No gallery. Just her, Damiano Valenti, and whatever it was he was quietly telling the federal government. Serena folded the envelope and put it in her bag. You're the glass, she told herself for the second time that day. But she walked out of the courthouse already knowing that she was going to read everything available on Damiano Valenti tonight. Every public record, every deposition transcript, every piece of financial documentation that wasn't sealed. Not because she was scared, because she wasn't, and that more than anything was the problem. Serena didn't sleep. She told herself she would. Told herself she'd spend 2 hours on the public records, close her laptop by 10, and be in bed before 11 like a reasonable adult who had an 8 a.m. federal proceeding to prepare for. She made that promise to herself while boiling water for pasta she didn't end up eating, while her downstairs neighbor practiced the same 4 bars of something on a keyboard at a volume that suggested the walls in her building were made of suggestion rather than material. By midnight, she had read everything that wasn't sealed. By 2 a.m., she'd gone back and read it again, because the first pass had produced a portrait of Damiano Valenti that didn't fit together, and the second pass confirmed it wasn't her reading that was off. The public record on Damiano Valenti was a study in absence. There were allegations, a federal indictment that had been pending for 3 years, civil asset forfeiture proceedings against a shipping logistics company registered in Delaware, a 2019 congressional subcommittee reference to a northern network operating through legitimate maritime commerce. There were names connected to him in footnotes and in the margins of other cases, the way certain people only appeared in documentation as shadows behind someone else's story. But there were no convictions. Not one. Not a misdemeanor, not a traffic violation, nothing. Either Damiano Valenti was genuinely careful enough to have operated at the alleged scale for 15 years without a single prosecutable error, or the cases that should have produced convictions had a way of dissolving before they reached that point. Witnesses who stopped cooperating, evidence that was suppressed on procedural grounds. One case in 2021 where the lead investigator had retired abruptly 4 months before trial, citing health reasons, and the replacement hadn't been able to reconstruct the evidentiary chain in time. Serena closed her laptop at 2:47 and stared at the ceiling. "You're the glass," she thought. "You translate. You do not investigate. You do not form opinions about defendants." She was at the federal building at 7:30. The room they'd assigned for the cooperation proceedings was on the 4th floor, away from the public courtrooms. Smaller, utilitarian, the kind of space that existed purely for function. A rectangular table. 6 chairs. A recording setup in the corner that looked new. 2 windows with the blinds drawn. A USA Marcus Webb was already there when she arrived, along with a woman Serena didn't recognize, who turned out to be Webb's co-counsel, a federal attorney named Dana Park, who shook Serena's hand with the brisk efficiency of someone who had 17 things to do before lunch and was already running behind on 2 of them. "You reviewed the materials?" Webb asked. "The documents I was cleared to access." "Yes." "Good." He set a folder on the table in front of the chair he was apparently designating as hers. "Today is preliminary. We're establishing the scope of what he's offering. Your job is to ensure precision. If there's any ambiguity in phrasing, any dialect variance that could affect how a statement is interpreted on the record, flag it immediately. Don't smooth things over. Don't choose the polite translation. Give us the exact meaning." "That's what I always do," Serena said. Webb looked at her with the expression of a man who had been disappointed by professionals before and was maintaining cautious optimism. "Good." The door opened at 8:03. Damiano came in with 1 lawyer. Not the full team from yesterday, just a single attorney, a compact Italian-American man in his 50s named Gerald Russo, who had the bearing of someone who had sat in rooms like this many times and had stopped being impressed by any of it. Behind them, a single federal marshal who took a position near the door and became invisible. Damiano looked at the room. He looked at the recording setup. He looked at Serena. He sat down. "Ms. Belandi," he said in standard Italian. "Mr. Valenti," she said in standard Italian, because she was the glass and this was a formal proceeding, and the conversation in the emptied courtroom yesterday had not happened as far as this table was concerned. Something in the corner of his expression acknowledged this without comment. Webb opened his folder. "Mr. Valenti, before we begin, for the record, you understand that the statements you make in this room are being provided voluntarily as part of a preliminary cooperation framework, and that anything you say may be used in subsequent proceedings pending the formalization of any agreement." Russo nodded. "My client understands." "And you're prepared to begin today?" Damiano answered before Russo could. "I've been prepared for 8 months, he said in English. "You weren't ready before now." Webb's jaw tightened. We had investigative requirements to... I know what you had, Damiano said mildly. I'm not complaining. I'm stating a fact. Begin whenever you'd like. Dana Park had her pen poised over a legal pad. She didn't look up, but Serena saw her write something that wasn't a note about the proceedings. Webb gathered himself. Mr. Valenti, the government's position is that you have information material to the prosecution of at least 4 organized crime networks operating in the northeastern United States. In exchange for that information, plus operational assistance in certain areas we'll define, the government is prepared to offer... I don't want immunity, Damiano said. The room stopped. Webb looked up from his folder. Excuse me? Immunity. Damiano said it the way you'd repeat a word in a foreign language that you'd understood perfectly the first time, but were clarifying for the speaker's benefit. I'm not here for immunity. I'm aware that's what your framework assumes. It's not what I'm asking for. Russo, to his credit, did not look surprised. He had clearly been here before. Webb looked at Dana Park. Dana Park looked at her legal pad. Serena looked at the recorder and made sure she'd captured that exchange correctly, because the precision of this particular moment was going to matter to someone, somewhere, at some point in the future. Then what? Webb said carefully. Are you asking for? Damiano leaned forward and put both forearms on the table. It was the first time Serena had seen him take up space that way. Not the settled, contained posture from the courtroom, but something more direct, more physical. There are 47 people, he said. Wives, children, 3 elderly mothers who don't know what their sons actually do and never did. People who were born into these families the same way you were born into yours. Say, they didn't choose it. They just woke up one day and it was their life, he paused. They cannot be protected by witness protection. The program has leaks. I've seen 3 people placed in it over the last decade. 2 of them are dead. One of them wishes he was. Webb said nothing. What I want, Damiano continued, is a guarantee. Not for myself. A guarantee that those 47 people are relocated, provided with documentation and financial resources sufficient to start clean lives, and that no one in this building or any building connected to this building shares their locations with anyone outside a list of 4 names that I will provide. Webb set his pen down. Mr. Valenti, what you're describing is a parallel relocation operation that would require... I know what it requires. Damiano's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I've already built it. I just need your people to stay out of the way while I finish it. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silence from the courtroom yesterday. That had been personal, contained, a thing between 2 people. This one was structural. It filled the room from the floor up. Serena translated everything that had been said in the last several minutes into the formal record notation she used for her notes, and she was very careful not to let anything she was thinking show on her face. What she was thinking was, that doesn't sound like a man protecting his empire. What she was thinking was, that sounds like a man who decided something a long time ago and has been working backward from it ever since. What she was thinking was that she had read everything available on Damiano Valenti last night, and none of it had suggested this. The morning session ran 2.5 hours. Webb asked questions. Damiano answered them with the methodical patience of someone who had prepared for this for longer than the government had been paying attention. Russo interjected 3 times on procedural grounds and was overruled twice and sustained once. Serena translated. She translated accurately, as she always did. She flagged 2 dialect variations and 1 phrase that had a legal distinction in Italian that didn't map cleanly to English, and Webb made notes of each flag and asked her to provide written clarification for the record, which she would. She also, for the first time in 11 years of federal interpretation, began catching things that were not part of her job. The 3rd time Damiano referenced a relocation, he used a word that was standard Italian for transfer, but his inflection put the emphasis a syllable off from where standard Italian would place it. It was the kind of shift you'd only hear if you'd grown up with the dialect variant. The kind of shift that could mean the difference between I moved them and I moved them before something else happened. She didn't flag it. It wasn't her job to flag implication. She translated the word accurately and wrote it down and moved on. But she felt it. At lunch, the federal team retreated to a conference room down the hall to confer. Russo left to make calls. The marshal rotated out. Damiano stayed at the table. He poured himself water from the pitcher that had been sitting at the center of the table since 8 a.m. and was now room temperature, and he drank it like a man who had stopped having preferences about certain things. Serena gathered her notes. She was going to leave. She was going to find the break room and eat the lunch she had actually remembered to pack this morning because yesterday's missed pasta dinner meant she'd had nothing since 6 a.m. except coffee. The settimana variant, Damiano said. She stopped. In the document yesterday, the phrase about receivables. He set the glass down. You translated it as anticipated holdings rather than current claims, which is correct for the dialect, but Webb didn't understand why it mattered. It matters because anticipated holdings are speculative, Serena said, despite herself, and current claims are enforceable. If a prosecutor treats speculative figures as enforceable assets, the entire asset forfeiture calculation is wrong by about $9 million. He nodded. I know, I was watching to see if you'd catch it. Serena looked at him. Why? Because the 9 million matters less than whether I can trust the person translating for me. You don't need to trust me. You need to speak. I translate what you say accurately. That's the agreement. That's not the only thing happening in this room, Damiano said. She picked up her notepad. I'll see you at 1 o'clock, Mr. Valenti. There are things in those documents, he said, that aren't being translated. She stopped again. Her back was to him. Things you're not supposed to see, he said, but you already see them, because you're reading the dialect layers, not just the surface content. And I think you haven't said anything yet because you're not sure what you're looking at. Serena turned around. I'm going to give you some advice, she said, as the interpreter assigned to this proceeding. The federal attorneys in this building are not your friends. The agreement you're building with them is not a friendship. Every word you say in this room goes into a record that will be used to construct a legal outcome that may or may not serve your interests. What I'd strongly recommend is that you speak only what you intend for that record. Damiano looked at her for a moment. That wasn't advice about the proceeding, he said. That was a warning. She said nothing. I appreciate it, he said without sarcasm. Genuinely. She left. The afternoon session started at 1 and ran until 4:30, and by the third hour something had shifted in the temperature of the room that Serena couldn't immediately name. Webb had come back from lunch with harder questions. The kind that suggested his conference room conversation had produced a recalibration. He pushed on the timeline of the relocation network. When had it started? Who was funding it? How many people had already been moved and where? Damiano answered everything, not evasively, not in the calculated, partial way that characterized most cooperation testimonies she'd sat through. He answered with the kind of comprehensive specificity that only exists when someone has been carrying information for a long time and has finally decided to put it down. But 3 times during the afternoon session, he referenced a location, a warehouse facility connected to a logistics subsidiary, and each time the reference was slightly different, not in the facts, in the relationship. The first reference put the facility in active use, the second put it in the past tense, the third used a verb form that suggested it was scheduled to be transferred. Serena translated each reference as given. She did not flag it to Webb. She wrote it in her own notes, in the margin, in the shorthand she'd developed over 11 years that nobody else could read. She did not know yet what she was going to do with it. At 4:30, Webb called it. We'll continue tomorrow at 9. Mr. Valenti, I'd ask you to review the financial summary documents your counsel has been provided and be prepared to address the offshore routing structure in the morning. Damiano nodded. He stood. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at Serena as he picked up the one folder he'd brought, not like yesterday, with the quiet amusement. This was something different, more level, more like the way you look at someone when you're trying to decide how much to give them. You flagged the 2 dialect variations, he said. You didn't flag the 3 location references. Serena kept her voice completely neutral. The location references were consistent with the content. There was nothing requiring clarification. There were 3 different verb structures, all of which were accurately reflected in my translations. He held her gaze for a beat longer, then he nodded. A small, specific nod that meant he'd heard something she hadn't technically said. "Tomorrow at 9, he said, and left. Webb was already on his phone in the hallway. Dana Park was packing her bag. The marshal was waiting by the elevator. Serena stood alone in the room for a moment with her notepad and her notes and the recording equipment that was now off. She looked at the 3 margin notations she'd made. The warehouse facility. The 3 different verb structures. The timeline that didn't quite line up. If the first reference was accurate, the facility was currently active. If the third was accurate, it was being transferred in the near future, which meant someone was expecting it to exist through a timeline that hadn't concluded yet, which meant something was still in motion that wasn't in any of the documents she'd been cleared to access. It's not your job, she thought. She was right. It wasn't. She closed her notepad and put it in her bag and walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby and wrote it down in silence. She made it all the way to the revolving door at the building's entrance before she stopped, because she had thought of something. The word Damiano had used in the third location reference, the verb form for the scheduled transfer. It was the same word her grandmother had used for the migration of seasonal workers from the western provinces. The ones who moved, not because they'd finished, but because what was coming required them to be somewhere else before it arrived. You didn't use that word for a building being sold. You used it for people running. She stood in the revolving door for long enough that a man in a gray coat behind her said, "Excuse me, are you going out?" And she said, "Yes, sorry," and pushed through. Outside, the Chicago October hit her full in the face, cold, specific, smelling of the lake, and she stood on the courthouse steps and thought about 47 people. Wives, children, 3 elderly mothers, and a man who had spent 8 months waiting for a government that wasn't ready yet while building something of his own on the side. She was still thinking about it on the train home. She was still thinking about it when she unlocked her apartment door. She was thinking about it when she sat down at her kitchen table and opened her notepad and looked at the 3 notations in the margin. Tomorrow at 9, Damiano Valenti was going to walk back into that room and answer Webb's questions about offshore routing structures. He was going to be precise and cooperative and give the federal government enough to move forward on. He was going to do everything the agreement required. And somewhere in the gaps between what he said and what he didn't say, something else was happening. Something he was running in parallel. Something that involved a facility that was still active and a timeline that hadn't concluded, and 47 people who needed to be somewhere else before whatever was coming arrived. Serena picked up her pen. She stared at the blank page below her margin notes. She was the glass. She was the conduit. She was the professional non-presence that allowed other people's words to travel from one language to another without interference or opinion or personality. She wrote one sentence. He's hiding something. Not from the prosecutors. She stared at it. From the people who don't know he's cooperating yet. She capped the pen, and then her phone rang. Unknown number. Chicago area code. She answered it. There was a pause. Not the empty pause of a dropped call, but the occupied pause of someone deciding, in real time, how to begin. Then a voice said, in Sicilian, "Ms. Belandi, we need to talk about the man you've been translating for, and we need to talk about it before you go back in that room tomorrow." It was not Damiano's voice. It was older, harder, with an accent that placed it not in Palermo's western province, but somewhere south of it, the kind of Sicilian that had been spoken in a different kind of room entirely. Serena's hand tightened on the phone. "Who is this?" she said in English. The voice switched to English without missing a beat. "Someone who's been watching that building for 3 days. Someone who knows what Valenti is telling your federal friends. And someone who wants to make very sure that you understand what happens to people who help him finish what he started." The call ended. Serena sat at her kitchen table with the dead phone in her hand and the notepad in front of her and the Chicago wind finding every gap in her window frame, and she understood with complete physical certainty that as of approximately 40 seconds ago, she had run out of the option of staying invisible. She wasn't the glass anymore. She was in the water. Serena did not call the police. She sat with that decision for approximately 4 minutes, turning it over the way you turn over a rock to see what's living underneath it. And what she found underneath it was this: Whoever had called her knew she was the interpreter on the Valenti cooperation proceedings. That was not public information. That information lived inside the federal building, inside the marshal's office assignment system, inside the case management files that were supposed to be sealed, which meant calling the police meant calling people who existed inside the same system that had already been penetrated. She put the phone on the table. She looked at it. She picked up her notepad and wrote the number down from her recent calls log before she forgot it, even though she knew it would trace to a prepaid and produce nothing. She wrote it down anyway because writing things down was how she processed, had always been how she processed. Her grandmother used to say she came out of the womb looking for something to annotate. She didn't sleep again. This was becoming a pattern she needed to address. At 6:15, she was dressed. At 7, she was on the train. At 7:40, she was standing outside the federal building in the October cold, and she had made a decision that she hadn't entirely finished making yet, but was going to commit to anyway, because the alternative was to go home and lock the door and wait for something to happen to her, which was not an option her body would physically accept. She was going to tell Damiano about the call. Not Webb, not Dana Park, not the marshal's office. Damiano. Because whoever had called her last night wasn't calling to warn her. They were calling to evaluate her, to see what she'd do, to measure whether she was someone who could be used or someone who needed to be managed. And the fact that they'd called at all meant they were worried about what Damiano was telling the government, which meant whatever he was doing was working, which meant, and this was the part that had kept her awake staring at her ceiling, he was further along than anyone in that room knew. She found Russo in the hallway outside the fourth-floor conference room at 7:55, on his phone, looking like a man who'd also had a difficult night. She waited until he finished the call. "I need 5 minutes with your client before the session starts," she said. Russo looked at her with the expression of a defense attorney evaluating an unexpected variable. Why? Because there's information he needs to have before he says anything on the record this morning. Information that affects his security. Russo was quiet for 3 seconds, long enough to tell her he was taking it seriously. 2 minutes, he said. And I'm in the room. Damiano was already inside, jacket on, both hands flat on the table. He looked up when they came in. He read something in her face that she hadn't intended to transmit, and his posture changed. Not visibly, barely a degree, but she caught it. "Someone called me last night," she said. She didn't sit down. "Unknown number, Sicilian accent, southern province. They told me they'd been watching this building for 3 days and that they know what you're telling the prosecutors. And they told me I should understand what happens to people who help you finish what you started." The room was quiet. Russo said, "We need to notify the marshal's office immediately." "No," Damiano said. Russo turned to him. "Damiano, not yet." Damiano was looking at Serena. "Southern province. How far south? Agrigento or below?" The vowel compression pattern. He nodded slowly. One nod, like she'd just confirmed something he'd hoped not to confirm. "Did they say anything else?" he asked. That was everything. The call lasted about 20 seconds. "And you came to me first." It wasn't a question. He was reading the fact of it, not asking her to explain it. "I came to you first because whoever called me got my name from inside this building. And that means the circle of people I can trust with this is very small." Damiano held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked at Russo. "Get the southern route contact on a secure line before noon. Tell him the Agrigento family is moving faster than I estimated." Russo's jaw tightened. "You said we had 3 weeks." "I was wrong." Damiano. Gerald. The single word had the quality of a door closing quietly but firmly. Russo stopped talking. Damiano looked back at Serena. "Thank you," he said. In Sicilian. She didn't answer in Sicilian. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, because Webb and Dana Park were going to walk in within the next 4 minutes, and she had one question she needed answered before they did. "The warehouse facility," she said, "the one you referenced 3 different ways yesterday." He didn't flinch. "You use transfer language in the 3rd reference," she said. "Migration language, not sale language. There are still people there." Silence. "I translated it accurately," she said. "I didn't flag it to Webb. But I need to know if what I didn't flag put those people at more risk or less risk. Because if it's more, I need to recalibrate what my job is in this room. Damiano looked at her for a long moment. It was the most direct he'd looked at her, without the amusement, without the evaluation, without any of the layers she'd been cataloging since he walked into the courtroom 2 days ago. Less risk, he said quietly. If Webb knows they're still there, he's obligated to report the location through federal channels. And those channels have leaks, she said. Have leaks, he confirmed. The door opened. Webb came in with Dana Park and 2 additional people she hadn't seen before. A man and a woman, both in the anonymous professional clothing of federal agency personnel who were trying not to look like federal agency personnel. Webb said, "Ms. Belandi, good morning." He looked at the room arrangement. "We have 2 additional observers today from a coordinating agency. They'll be silent participants." Damiano looked at the 2 new people with the flat attention he'd given the room on the first day of the public hearing. The cataloging look. Russo leaned toward Damiano and said something very quietly. Damiano shook his head, once. The session began. For the first hour, it was technical. Webb walked through the offshore routing structure, shell companies, correspondent banking relationships, the layered movement of funds through jurisdictions that either had no information-sharing agreements with the U.S. or had agreements that were slow enough to be useless in real time. Damiano answered every question. He produced details that made Dana Park's pen move continuously across her legal pad. Serena translated. She watched the 2 observers. They were writing too, but their notes were being taken on devices, not paper, and their attention was split between Damiano and something on the screen of a tablet that was angled so she couldn't see it. At the 90-minute mark, Webb said, "Mr. Valenti, I want to turn to the relocation network specifically. You've indicated that you have 47 individuals in various stages of a parallel protection program. I need you to walk me through the current status of each placement." Damiano said, "I've provided that information in summary form to counsel. I need it on the record, with locations." Russo interjected immediately. "The government's request for location specifics was not part of the agreed disclosure framework for today's." "The framework has been updated," the female observer said. Everyone looked at her. It was the first time either observer had spoken. She had the quality of someone who was accustomed to speaking once in a room and having it settle every remaining question. She reached into her jacket and set a document on the table. "Updated disclosure parameters signed this morning by the supervising federal judge. Location specifics for all individuals in the parallel network are now required for the cooperation agreement to proceed." Russo picked up the document. His face did the thing that faces do when something that was supposed to be a manageable situation has revealed a different and more complicated shape. Damiano had gone very still. Serena translated the brief exchange that had required Italian. A single phrase from Russo to Damiano, a single phrase back. She kept her voice level. She kept her hands still. She did not look at Damiano's face directly, but she felt the shift in the room the way she'd felt the shift when he'd first walked into the courtroom. The pressure drop. The thing in the air before the storm. "Give us 15 minutes, Russo said. Webb checked his watch. 10. They stepped into the hallway, Russo and Damiano, with the marshal following at a professional distance. The 2 observers remained at the table. Webb poured himself water. Dana Park reviewed her notes. Serena sat at her station and wrote in her notepad in the shorthand nobody could read. "Updated parameters signed this morning." They didn't tell Russo in advance. That means the change wasn't negotiated. It was imposed, which means someone above Webb made a decision overnight. She looked at the female observer, who was looking at her tablet. Someone above Webb made a decision overnight, on the same night that someone called me to warn me away from this proceeding. She wrote one more line. These things are connected. She capped her pen. When Damiano came back into the room, something in his face had been reorganized. Not the expression. The expression was still controlled, still the settled landscape she'd studied for 2 days. But something structural underneath it had been rearranged. The way a building looks the same after the foundation shifts it, until you know what you're looking at. He sat down. He looked at Russo. Russo looked at the table. Webb said, "Ready to continue?" There's a problem, Damiano said. Webb set down his water glass. Mr. Valenti, 3 of the locations I would have provided today are no longer secure. The room crystallized. What do you mean, no longer secure? Webb said. I mean that as of approximately 11 o'clock last night, I received communication indicating that the Agrigento network had obtained location information on 3 of my placements. Damiano's voice was level in the way that requires active maintenance. Which means one of 2 things. Either my internal network has a breach I haven't identified, or the location information was sourced from somewhere else. He looked at the 2 observers. Somewhere that had access to the disclosure summaries I provided to counsel last week. The female observer's expression didn't change. The male observer's did. Very slightly. Just around the eyes. Serena saw it. She didn't think anyone else did. Webb said, Are you suggesting that this office— I'm stating a fact about timing, Damiano said. I provided the summaries Thursday. By Sunday night, 3 locations were compromised. You can draw your own conclusions about the sequence. The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room from the walls inward rather than from the center out. Dana Park had stopped writing. Webb's expression had gone through careful and was heading toward something harder. Russo said, very quietly, We need to suspend this session pending an internal review of disclosure handling. Absolutely not, the female observer said. You don't have the authority to— Check the document again, she said, still calm. Still with that quality of someone who had spoken once and expected the room to arrange itself accordingly. Russo checked the document. Something in his shoulders changed. Damiano watched this happen. He watched Russo's shoulders change, and then he looked at Serena. She was already looking at him. He held it for 1 second, 1 specific second in which she understood, with the particular precision of someone who translates for a living and has therefore spent 11 years understanding that language is only the surface of what's actually being communicated, that he was telling her something. This is going wrong faster than I planned for. Then he looked away. Webb cleared his throat. We'll take a 30-minute recess. He looked at the observers. I need a word with my colleagues. They filed out. Russo followed. The marshal stayed. Serena started to gather her notes. Ms. Belandi. Damiano's voice was quiet enough that the marshal, who had repositioned to near the door, likely didn't catch it. When this session resumes, there are going to be questions about the Northern Placement Facility, the one on the record as a logistics subsidiary. She kept gathering her notes. I translate what's said. I don't control the questions. I know, but when the questions come, there's a name that will come up in the documents. A woman named Rosa Ferraro. She's listed as a financial administrator for the subsidiary. Serena stopped moving. She's not, Damiano said. She's one of the 47. She's been at that facility for 3 months because we couldn't move her safely until a particular person in the Agrigento network was no longer a problem. That person is no longer a problem as of 48 hours ago. She was supposed to be moved today. He paused. She doesn't know about any of this. She thinks she works for a logistics company. She's been living that life for 3 months. Serena looked at him. Why are you telling me this? Because if her name comes up on the record today with her actual location attached to it, and that record goes anywhere near whoever compromised those 3 placements last night— He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Serena sat back down. What you're asking me to do, she said slowly, is outside the scope of my assignment. I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm telling you about a person. You're telling me about a person in a way that is clearly intended to influence how I handle related content in this proceeding, which is me trusting you with the only thing I have left to leverage, he said. And for the first time in 3 days, there was something in his voice that wasn't controlled. Not much. A thread of it. The kind of thing that escapes when the maintenance gets too expensive. The network is compromised somewhere. My lawyer just found out his motion authority in this proceeding was overridden this morning without notice. 3 of my people are in locations that aren't safe anymore, and I'm sitting in a federal building that has a leak I can't locate, trying to finish something I've been building for 8 months. And the one person in this room who I know reads the full conversation, and not just the words, is you. The marshal shifted near the door. Serena looked at her notepad, at her margin notations, at the one sentence she'd written last night that she'd capped her pen on and told herself was the end of something. She thought about the phone call, the voice from south of Agrigento. What happens to people who help him finish what he started? She thought about 11 years of being invisible, of being good at it, of being proud of it. She thought about Rosa Ferraro, who had been living someone else's life for 3 months in a building she thought was a logistics company, who didn't know that the walls around her were running out of time. "I translate what is said," Serena told him. "Accurately, completely, with all required notations. That is my job, and I will do it." She let that sit for a moment. "However," she said, and she kept her voice at the same professional level she'd used for 11 years in rooms like this one. "Translation is an interpretive act. When there is genuine ambiguity in a source term, regional variation, dialectal nuance, context-dependent meaning, it is within professional protocol to request clarification before rendering a final translation for the record. Such clarifications can take time, and during clarification periods, proceedings are typically paused." Damiano looked at her. "That's not a guarantee," she said. "That's an explanation of standard protocol." "I understand," he said. The 30-minute recess ran 45. When Webb and the observers returned, Dana Park had a new document in her hand, and the expression of someone who had lost an argument in the last 30 minutes and was managing it professionally. The session resumed. The questions about the northern facility came 30 minutes later, exactly as Damiano had predicted. Webb asked about Rosa Ferraro specifically, with a document that listed her by name and position. He asked Damiano to confirm her location for the record. Damiano began answering. In Italian, mixed register, with a specific regional verb construction that carried 2 possible location references depending on whether you read it as present state or as designation. Serena raised her hand. Webb stopped. "Ms. Belandi? I need to request clarification on the verb construction in the response before I can render an accurate translation for the record," she said. "The term used has a significant dialectal ambiguity that would affect the legal meaning of the location reference. I'll need approximately 10 minutes to consult my reference materials and confirm the appropriate rendering." Webb looked at the observers. The female observer's eyes had gone flat and calculating. 10 minutes, Webb said. The proceeding paused. Serena picked up her notepad and walked to the corner of the room where her reference bag sat, and she sat down on the chair there, and she opened her bag and she counted to 3 in her head. Somewhere in this building, there was a leak. Somewhere in the last 48 hours, 3 locations had been compromised through information that had originated in federal documents. Somewhere south of Agrigento, a voice on a prepaid phone was watching this building and measuring what she would do. And in a logistics facility that was not a logistics facility, a woman named Rosa Ferraro was going about her day, thinking she was safe, not knowing that the clock on her safety had been running without her knowledge for 3 months. Serena pulled out her reference binder. She opened it to a page she did not actually need. She looked at the entries on the page without reading them. She was thinking about what Damiano had said this morning, in the 2 minutes before Webb arrived. If Webb knows they're still there, he's obligated to report the location through federal channels. And those channels have leaks. She was thinking about the updated disclosure parameters, signed this morning by a supervising judge, that had overridden Russo's motion authority without advance notice. She was thinking about the female observer's tablet, angled so it couldn't be seen, about the male observer's eyes when Damiano mentioned the compromised locations. And she was thinking about a sentence her grandmother had told her once, about the difference between the law and justice, which was not the same sentence everyone's grandmother said, but a specific one, in the specific dialect that meant, the law is what the room agrees to call true. Justice is what is actually true when the room empties. Her 10 minutes were running. She was going to go back to that table. She was going to render a translation. She was going to make a choice about which version of her professional obligation she was going to live inside for the rest of this proceeding. And she understood, sitting in that corner with her reference binder open to a page she didn't need, that the choice wasn't actually about Rosa Ferraro, or about Damiano, or even about the leak in the federal building that had put 3 people in danger. The choice was about what kind of glass she was. Because glass could be clear and passive, carrying light through without altering it, or glass could be a lens, and a lens changed where the light went. Her 10 minutes ended. She closed the binder. She walked back to the table and sat down and looked at Marcus Webb and said, "I have the clarification. The verb construction indicates designation rather than present state. The individual in question is designated for the northern facility administratively, but is not currently located there." Which was not a lie. Rosa Ferraro was designated as a financial administrator for the northern facility on paper. She was not, in the technical sense, located there. She was located in a different part of the building complex, in the residential section that didn't appear in the administrative records. The distinction was technically valid. It was also, and Serena understood this completely, the moment she stopped being the glass. Webb wrote something down. Donna Park wrote something down. The female observer wrote something on her tablet with a stylus quickly and angled it back away. Damiano did not look at Serena, but his right hand resting on the table was still. The index finger did not tap. For the first time since the hearing began, Damiano Valenti did not file something away, because he didn't need to. The session continued for another 90 minutes. When it ended, Webb announced they would resume the following morning. People gathered their things. Russo spoke quietly to Damiano near the door. Serena was capping her pen when the female observer appeared at her elbow. She hadn't heard her approach, which was impressive and also deeply unsettling. "Ms. Belandi," the observer said. Her voice was the professional neutral of someone trained to sound like every other professional neutral. "The clarification you provided on the Ferraro location designation, can you walk me through the specific dialectal basis for that interpretation?" Serena looked at her. She looked at the observer's face, which was composed and patient, and watching her with the same flat attention the male observer had been using all day on his tablet. "Of course," Serena said, "it's a standard distinction in the Palermo Western Province Register between administrative assignment and physical presence. I can provide written documentation of the linguistic basis if required for the record." "That would be helpful," the observer said. "I'll need it by 8 tomorrow morning." She walked away. Serena stood at the table alone for a moment after the room cleared. She had just committed to producing written linguistic documentation to support a translation choice that was technically accurate and deliberately incomplete for a federal observer whose connection to the compromised locations she was approximately 70% certain about and had no way to prove. By 8 tomorrow morning, she picked up her bag, she walked to the door. She walked down the hall to the elevator and pressed the button and stood waiting for it. The elevator opened. She stepped in. As the doors closed, she caught a glimpse of Damiano at the far end of the hallway, stopped, talking to Russo. He wasn't looking in her direction. But Russo was. And Russo's expression was the expression of a man who had just recalculated something important about the size of the problem he was managing and had arrived at a number significantly larger than the one he'd started the day with. The elevator doors closed. Serena rode it down 17 floors in the specific silence of someone who has just stepped off a ledge and has not yet determined whether there is ground below. The lobby doors opened into the Chicago evening, and the cold came at her again, and she walked to the train with her bag over her shoulder and her notepad in her hand, and the full knowledge that by 8 tomorrow morning she was going to have done something she had no preparation for, and that whatever it was going to have to be enough to keep a woman named Rosa Ferraro alive inside a building that was running out of time. She didn't go home. That was the first decision, made somewhere between the elevator lobby and the revolving door, before she'd fully articulated it to herself. Going home meant sitting at her kitchen table with a notepad and 8 hours to construct a linguistic justification document that would either satisfy a federal observer who might be compromised or accelerate whatever was coming. Going home was waiting. She was done waiting. She stood on the courthouse steps for 90 seconds in the cold, and then she called the only number she had for Russo's office. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail, and she said, "This is Serena Belandi. I need to speak with your client tonight. It's not optional." She hung up. She walked 2 blocks north and stood at a crosswalk, and her phone rang 40 seconds later. "Where are you?" Russo's voice was tight. 2 blocks from the building. "Don't move." 8 minutes later, a black car pulled to the curb. Not a federal vehicle, no plates she recognized, civilian registration, the kind of car that existed in the inventory of people who needed unremarkable transportation. The back door opened. Damiano was inside. She got in. The car moved immediately, pulling into traffic without drama, heading west. The driver was one of the security men from the courtroom, the one who'd become furniture most effectively. He didn't look at them in the rearview mirror. Damiano looked at her. He'd taken off the jacket. His sleeves were rolled up, and there was a quality to him that she hadn't seen in 3 days of courtroom and conference room, something that suggested the controlled surface was running on less reserve than usual. The observer asked me for written documentation, Serena said. By 8 tomorrow. Linguistic basis for the Ferraro translation. I know. Russo told me. If I produce that document, it either satisfies her or it confirms to her that I know what she's looking for. Either way, she has a paper trail connected to me. Yes. And if I don't produce it, she files a complaint with the marshal's office alleging interpreter misconduct, and you're removed from the proceeding by 9 a.m. He said it flat, no cushioning, and replaced by someone I haven't met. Serena looked out the window. The city moved past. Storefronts, streetlights, a woman pushing a stroller against the wind with the grim determination of someone who has given up expecting the weather to cooperate. Who is she? Serena asked. Her name, on the credentials she presented, is Claire Novak. She's listed as a coordinating liaison from a federal task force oversight office. He paused. That office doesn't have liaisons with her clearance level assigned to preliminary cooperation proceedings. The paperwork is real. The reason she's in that room isn't. She's Agrigento. She's someone Agrigento put inside a federal structure, which is different and worse, because she has legitimate access to the documentation trail. Serena processed this. The car turned south, then east, navigating in the direction of the lake. The 3 placements that were compromised, she said. She had access to the summaries. Since Thursday. You knew before today. He looked at her. I suspected before today. I confirmed it when she asked about Ferraro specifically. The Ferraro designation wasn't in the summaries I provided to counsel. It was in a separate financial appendix that only went to the Oversight Coordinating Office. He said it without anger, which was somehow harder to sit with than anger would have been. So yes, I know who the leak is, and she knows that I know, which is why she asked you for the document. She's not looking for linguistic justification. She's measuring how much you understand. And what happens when she finishes measuring? He didn't answer immediately. The car slowed at a light. The driver's hands were steady on the wheel. The Agrigento network has been trying to locate Bianca for 6 weeks, Damiano said. Serena went still. Your sister. She's been housed at the northern facility for the last month, not in the administrative section. He paused. In the residential section, which doesn't appear in the administrative records, which Rosa Ferraro doesn't know about because Rosa is in the administrative section and they haven't met. So when you told me Ferraro wasn't currently located at the facility, I told you the truth. Ferraro is in the administrative section. Bianca is in the residential section. His jaw tightened. 2 different locations in the same building complex. The Ferraro designation was the thread. If Novak pulls it and gets the location, she has the building. And if she has the building, she has Bianca. She has 14 people, Bianca and 13 others who moved to that facility in the last 3 weeks because we ran out of time at their previous placements. He looked at his hands. They were very still. I have a team moving them tonight. It should take 6 hours. But 6 hours requires that nobody reports that location to Agrigento before the move is complete. Which is why you need me to produce a document that delays Novak. Which is why I need 8 hours. The car stopped. They were parked along the lakefront. The park was empty this time of evening, the water black and moving, the lights of the city reflected and broken on its surface. Serena looked at the lake for a moment. What you're asking me to do, she said, is obstruct a federal proceeding. I'm asking you to write a document about Sicilian dialectal variation, which I would be writing strategically with the explicit intention of delaying a federal observer, which is your professional judgment about how to handle an ambiguous translation request. His voice was level. I'm not asking you to lie. I'm asking you to be very thorough. Serena looked at him. 14 people, she said. 14 tonight. If the move completes, 51 total by the end of the week. She looked back at the lake. A wave hit the breakwater and dissolved into white noise and was gone. "I'll need access to a proper reference library," she said. "The documentation has to be airtight. If she takes it to a dialectology expert, it has to hold." Something in Damiano's face shifted. Just slightly. The maintenance got a little easier. "There's a university library access card in Rousseau's office," he said. "The Northwestern Linguistics Collection. Open until 11. That's 3 hours. Is that enough?" She thought about 11 years of keeping notes in shorthand nobody could read, about the research she did on every case, every dialect variation, every term with a legal implication she needed to be certain about. "It's enough," she said. She reached for the door handle. "Serena." She stopped. It was the first time he'd used her given name. Not Miss Belandi, not the formal address. Just her name, said quietly, without anything attached to it except the weight of what it cost him to ask for help. She turned. "If the move doesn't complete tonight," he said, "I need you to not be in that building tomorrow morning." She held his gaze. "And if it does complete?" He said nothing for a moment. "Then we both walk back in there at 9 a.m. and finish what we started." She got out of the car. The document took her until 1:47 in the morning. 11 pages, 15 citations from primary dialectological sources, 4 comparative analyses of regional verb construction patterns in Western and South Central Sicilian registers dating from the 19th century to the modern period. A technical appendix on the administrative versus physical designation distinction as it appeared in court interpretation precedent in 6 previous federal cases. It was, objectively, the most thorough translation clarification document she had ever produced in 11 years. It was also an act she could not entirely name and had stopped trying to name somewhere around midnight when she'd written the 7th citation and realized she was no longer doing it because Damiano had asked her to. She was doing it because Rosa Ferraro existed and Bianca existed and 13 other people existed in a building that had a clock running on it, and the document was the only tool she had. She sent it to Rousseau's office email at 1:53. She slept for 4 hours. Her phone rang at 5:41. Rousseau. "The move is complete," he said. "All 14. She lay on her back, staring at the ceiling for a moment. 8 a.m., she said. 8 a.m. She got up. She made coffee. She pressed her blazer, not the navy one, the charcoal one she kept for situations that required a different kind of presence, and she went back to the federal building. She was at her station at 7:58 when Novak arrived. Novak looked at her. It was a brief look, professional, the kind that cataloged without appearing to catalog. She had the document. Rousseau had apparently forwarded it to her overnight, as required by the preceding protocol. She sat down. She opened the document. She read it. Serena translated a brief preliminary exchange between Rousseau and Webb about the morning's agenda. She kept her hands still. She kept her breathing even. She had learned over 11 years that the body gave things away before the face did, and she was currently in a room with at least one person whose job was to read bodies. Novak finished reading. She set the document down. She wrote something on her tablet. The session began. For the first 40 minutes, it was procedural. Webb and Rousseau negotiating the scope of the morning's questioning, with 2 sidebar arguments that required the observers to be asked to step back. Standard proceeding mechanics. Then Webb said, "Mr. Valenti, I want to return to the northern facility. Given the clarification provided by the interpreter regarding the Ferraro designation, I want to confirm, are there individuals currently residing in any portion of the northern facility complex?" Damiano looked at him steadily. "No." Webb wrote something. "As of when?" "As of 5:43 this morning, when the last individual in the residential section of the complex was transported to a secure location I'll provide to you under separate seal." Novak's pen stopped moving. It was a small thing. The pen simply stopped halfway through a word and stayed there for approximately 2 seconds before it resumed. Serena saw it. Webb said, "You relocated individuals from that facility last night." "Yes." "You were not authorized to cheat." "I was not prohibited," Damiano said. "The cooperation agreement governs disclosure of information. It does not govern independent protective actions I take on behalf of individuals outside the formal protection program. He looked at Russo. Correct? Russo said, correct. Webb looked at Dana Park. Dana Park looked at her legal pad. There was a brief, dense silence during which multiple people in the room appeared to be mentally reviewing documentation. We'll need the transport details, Webb said. You'll have them under separate seal by end of day. I want a judicial review of the seal conditions before they go into the general case file. That's not standard, given that there appears to be a non-standard information pathway between the general case file and parties outside this proceeding, Damiano said, with the same mild, unhurried delivery he applied to everything. I think the accommodation is reasonable. Novak set her pen down. She looked at Damiano across the table with the flat attention she'd been directing at him since yesterday, and then she did something that changed the texture of the room. She looked at Serena. Not briefly. Not the cataloging look from this morning. A direct, held look that lasted long enough to mean something. Serena looked back. She kept her face exactly where it needed to be. Professional, present, neutral. The glass. Except the glass had a lens in it now, and she was done pretending it didn't. Novak looked away first. Webb called a 30-minute recess at 9:40. People stood, stretched, filed out. Serena was gathering her notepad when she registered that Novak had not moved to leave. She was still at the table, tablet face down now, both hands flat on the surface, waiting. The room emptied. The marshal rotated toward the hallway. Damiano was talking to Russo near the door. Ms. Belandi, Novak said. Serena stopped. The document you produced was thorough, Novak said. Her voice had the same professional neutral as always. Very thorough. The 19th century citations were a nice touch. Serena turned. I take accuracy seriously. I know you do. Novak tilted her head slightly. I also know that you received a phone call 2 nights ago from a number registered to a prepaid device purchased at a convenience store in Bridgeport, and that you came to this building the following morning 40 minutes before your required arrival time. The room was very quiet. And I know, Novak said, that you sat in the back of a civilian vehicle with Damiano Valenti for approximately 22 minutes last evening, parked along Lake Shore Drive. Serena kept her hands still. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she usually wasn't. Not racing, just present, loud. That's interesting information, Serena said. It is. Novak stood. She was shorter than she appeared sitting down, which somehow made her more rather than less unsettling. What's also interesting is that the northern facility is now empty, which makes it worthless to certain parties who were counting on it not being empty. That sounds like a logistical problem for those parties. It creates a different problem, Novak said. It tells those parties that someone warned Valenti that the location was compromised, which tells them the warning came from someone with access to the information flow in this proceeding. She paused. There are 6 people with that access. 3 of them are federal employees with 20-year careers and family members with names and addresses. 2 of them are Valenti's own counsel. She looked at Serena. And then there's you. Serena held it. Are you threatening me? She said, calm, level. The voice she used when someone across the table tried to use volume to make a translation go a different way. I'm explaining the situation, Novak said. The people looking for those 14 individuals are going to identify the source of the warning. That process is already underway. When they identify you, and they will, because you're the only variable in this proceeding without a 20-year institutional record, they're going to approach you. Like someone approached me 2 nights ago. Something moved behind Novak's eyes. Very fast. There and gone. I'd recommend, Novak said, that when they do, you're in a position to tell them something useful. Serena looked at her for a long moment. Something useful, she repeated. About where the 14 went, about what Valenti's next operational move is, about the timeline for the remaining relocations. Novak's voice hadn't changed in texture or volume through any of this. In exchange for which, the people asking are prepared to ensure that the attention currently coming your direction goes elsewhere. Serena understood now, fully and completely. Novak wasn't a leak. Novak was the conduit. She was the two-way valve, collecting from the preceding and delivering back, and now attempting to conscript Serena into the same function. "I'm an interpreter," Serena said. "I translate what's said. I don't carry information." "That was true 3 days ago," Novak said. "It's less true now." She picked up her tablet and walked out. Serena stood in the empty room. Her hands, which had been still through the entire conversation, were not entirely still now. She pressed the left one flat against the table and held it there and breathed. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. Her grandmother had taught her that, not as a wellness practice, just as the thing you did when the room got loud and you needed to hear yourself think. She needed to hear herself think. Novak had just told her 2 things simultaneously. First, that Serena was identified, exposed, and vulnerable in a way that was not going to go away. Second, that Novak had chosen to approach Serena privately rather than file the misconduct complaint she could have filed this morning, which meant Novak believed Serena was convertible, which meant Novak hadn't yet told her handlers that the Northern facility move had been internally flagged before it happened. Because if she had, and if they'd confirmed Serena's role, the conversation in this room would not have been a conversation. Novak was managing her own timeline, which meant there was still time. Serena picked up her notepad. She walked out of the conference room and down the hall to the water fountain outside the restrooms, and she stood there for a moment with the cold water running over her wrist, which she hadn't intended but didn't stop. She had until Novak filed her report. She didn't know when that was. Tonight. Tomorrow morning. Possibly this afternoon if Serena gave her any indication of resistance. She needed to tell Damiano. She couldn't tell him inside the building. She needed to tell him without Novak seeing the communication, which meant not the phone Webb's team had provided for preceding communications, not any channel that Novak could access through the case file. She turned off the water. She walked back toward the conference room. Russo was in the hallway, checking his watch. He looked up when he saw her and started to say something about the recess timing. She got close enough that her voice wouldn't carry. "She approached me directly," she said. "She wants me to report Valenti's next operational steps to Agrigento's people." Russo's face did the thing it had done yesterday when the disclosure parameters document had revealed its shape, the rapid recalculation behind the professional exterior. "She identified me as the variable," Serena continued. "She hasn't filed the misconduct complaint yet. She's running her own timeline. But she'll file the moment she decides I'm not going to cooperate. And then I'm out of this proceeding, and you have a different problem." Russo was quiet for 3 seconds. "How long do we have?" "I don't know. Hours, maybe?" He looked at his watch again, not to check the time, but to have something to do with his eyes while he thought. "I need to tell him." "I know. You can't do it in that room. There's a scheduled lunch break at 12:30. She'll have eyes on him at lunch." "Not in the building's lower level. There's a—" He stopped himself, looked at her, made a decision. "There's a maintenance corridor access on the B2 level that isn't on the public building schematic. I've used it before for client communications that couldn't go through standard channels." He said it with the flatness of a man who had stopped being embarrassed about the necessities of his practice. 12:32. Tell him you need a clarification on this morning's dialect content." She nodded. He walked away. She went back into the conference room and sat down and opened her notepad and stared at the blank page. Novak came back in at 10:04, followed by Webb and Dana Park, and the session resumed, and Serena translated with the full precision of 11 years because her hands knew how to do this, even when the rest of her was somewhere else entirely. She was counting down to 12:32. At 11:50, the session hit a procedural snag. A dispute over the classification level of a document Webb wanted entered into the cooperation record. It was the kind of argument that could eat 45 minutes. It ate 30. At 12:28, the recess was called. Serena excused herself to use the restroom. She went to the elevator instead. She took it to B2. The lower level smelled like concrete and recycled air, and the particular industrial quiet of a building's infrastructure. The guts of the thing, where nobody came unless something needed fixing. She found the maintenance corridor access, a door with a standard building keypad, except the keypad had a strip of tape over the third button that indicated, to someone who knew what they were looking at, that it had been bypassed. She pushed the door. Damiano was already there. The corridor was narrow and poorly lit. The the kind of space designed for utility rather than occupation. He was standing with his arms crossed, jacket back on, and his face had the look it had gotten in the car last night, the controlled surface running on less reserve than it wanted to project. "Russo told me," he said. "Then you know we have hours." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "She's going to file by tonight. If she files, the proceeding gets paused for review, which gives Agrigento time to regroup after losing the northern facility. They'll use that time to—" He stopped. "To what?" Serena said. He looked at her. "They took Bianca 6 hours ago." Everything stopped. "What?" The word came out smaller than she intended. "She wasn't at the northern facility. She was transferred with the others at 5:43 this morning. They had a different location flagged, one I hadn't disclosed to anyone." His jaw was tight enough that she could see the muscle working. "Someone on my internal team gave it up. I don't know who. I don't know when. I found out 40 minutes ago." Serena put her hand against the corridor wall. "Is she alive?" The question was brutal, and she asked it anyway because not asking it was worse. "Yes. They called Russo's office at 11:15. They want the names and current locations of every person I've relocated, all 51, in exchange for Bianca." He paused. "They've given me until 6 o'clock tomorrow morning." The corridor hummed around them, ventilation, water pipes, the baseline mechanical sound of a building doing its work. "If you give them the list," Serena said, 51 people die. Or worse. "And if you don't?" He didn't answer. She pushed off the wall. "There has to be another way. The federal team, Webb can authorize an extraction. Webb's operation runs through channels that Novak has access to. Any extraction authorized through the federal proceeding is compromised before it starts." His voice was controlled, but she could hear what was underneath it now, the thing that escaped when the maintenance got too expensive. "I have my own people, but Agrigento knows them. Anyone I send, they'll identify as mine, and the moment they do, they'll move Bianca to a location I can't reach." "Then who—" She heard herself say it a half-second before he did. "Someone they don't know," he said. "Someone not in my network, not in the federal network. Someone who can walk into a room where Damiano Valenti's people don't belong and not register as a threat." She looked at him. "No," she said. "Serena, I'm an interpreter. I translate. I am not—" She stopped. She heard her own voice doing the thing it had done 3 days ago in the conference room when she'd said, "You're the glass. Remember the glass?" Except now the voice was less certain, and the thing it was insisting on had already been partly dismantled. "I don't have training for this. I wouldn't know how to—" "You walked into a federal proceeding 2 days ago, identified a compromised federal observer, produced a document that bought 14 people 6 hours, and held a direct conversation with that observer without breaking." He looked at her steadily. "You know how to read a room. You know how to be invisible when visibility is dangerous. You know the language. Not just Italian, not just standard Sicilian, but the specific dialect that tells people you're from where you say you're from." He paused. "And they don't know your face." She stared at him. "There's a building," he said, "an industrial property in Cicero. The Agrigento network uses it as a transitional location for people they're moving or holding. It runs as a legitimate import business. I know the cover operation. I know the documentation they use. I know the personnel structure." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded paper. Actual paper, handwritten, which told her this hadn't gone through any digital channel. "There's a federal language compliance inspection protocol for import facilities. Standard process, real documentation, nothing about it that would require someone to be from law enforcement." He held the paper out. "A language compliance specialist investigating financial document accuracy. It's not a cover. It's a real federal protocol. You do this legitimately. You go in as what you actually are." Serena looked at the paper in his hand. She did not take it. "If they figure out what I'm actually doing in there," she said, "they won't. If they do—" His eyes didn't move from hers. "I'll be outside, with everyone I have left." "That's not an answer." "No," he said, "it's not." The corridor hummed. Somewhere above them, the federal proceeding was in recess, and Novak was somewhere in the building calculating her timeline. And 6 o'clock tomorrow morning was a fixed point on a clock that was already running. Serena looked at the paper. She thought about her grandmother's kitchen, about a word that meant people running before something arrived, about 47 people who became 51 and could become 0 by tomorrow morning. She thought about what her grandmother had said about the law and justice, and what was actually true when the room emptied. She took the paper. She unfolded it. She read it. She folded it again and put it in the inside pocket of her charcoal blazer, against her ribs, where she could feel it when she breathed. "I need 2 hours to prepare," she said. "And I need everything you have on the cover operation, personnel, documentation format, what a real inspection looks like. Russo has it. He'll get it to you before 3. She nodded. She turned to go back through the maintenance corridor door. "Serena." She stopped. She didn't turn around this time. She stood with her hand on the door and waited. "The first lesson," he said quietly. "The one you reminded me of. About the weapon nobody notices." She pushed the door open. "I know," she said, and she walked back into the building, with the folded paper against her ribs and 11 years of invisibility in her hands, toward the most important room she had ever walked into in her life. The document Russo gave her at 3 o'clock was 40 pages. She read it in an hour and 40 minutes, sitting in a coffee shop 3 blocks from the federal building, at a corner table with her back to the wall because Damiano's habits were apparently contagious. She read it the way she read legal transcripts, not for the surface, but for the architecture underneath. The cover operation was an import compliance firm called Meridian Document Services, which processed customs paperwork for mid-size freight operations. Real company, real federal registration, real clients. The Agrigento network used it as a front for moving money through freight invoicing, but the compliance inspection protocol Damiano had identified was genuine. The federal government periodically sent language specialists to verify that foreign language commercial documents met import accuracy standards. It was the kind of inspection that happened twice a year and that nobody paid attention to because it had never produced anything interesting. She wrote 4 pages of her own notes. She memorized the personnel structure Russo had included. The facility manager, a man named Testa, who'd been with the Agrigento operation for 11 years, 2 administrative staff who rotated, and a security presence that varied depending on what the facility was holding on any given day. Today, it was holding Bianca Valenti, which meant the security presence would not be the standard rotation. She closed the folder. She finished her coffee. She sat for a moment with her hands around the empty cup and thought about what she was about to do. And she was honest with herself about it, which was the only way she knew how to be about anything. She was scared, not the abstract managed anxiety she'd felt in difficult proceedings, the kind that sharpened focus and was basically useful. This was physical. Her body knew it was about to walk into a room where the stakes were not professional reputation or career integrity, but the specific, irreversible kind of consequence that didn't have an appeals process. She breathed, 4 seconds in, 4 out. Then she picked up the folder and walked back to Russo's satellite office 2 blocks over, where a woman she'd never met handed her a federal language compliance inspector badge with her actual name and photo on it, real credentials, processed through a legitimate federal contractor channel, because Damiano had apparently been building contingencies for contingencies, along with a briefcase containing the standard inspection documentation kit. The woman didn't explain anything. She handed Serena the materials and said, "Car's outside," and that was the full extent of the briefing. The car took her to Cicero at 4:45 tests. The Meridian Document Services facility was a 2-story commercial building on a street of identical 2-story commercial buildings, which was either good cover or a statement about the fundamental dullness of the import compliance industry. Probably both. There was a parking lot with 6 cars in it and a front entrance with glass doors and a reception desk visible through them. Serena sat in the car for 90 seconds. The driver, not the furniture man from before, someone new, someone she didn't have a name for, said nothing. He was looking straight ahead. "Is he out there?" she asked. 3 blocks east, the driver said. "Waiting." She got out of the car with the briefcase. She walked to the glass doors and pulled one open and went inside. The reception desk was staffed by a woman in her 30s with reading glasses pushed up on her head, who looked up with the expression of someone who'd been expecting a routine afternoon and was mildly annoyed by any deviation from it. "Can I help you?" Serena set her badge on the desk. "Federal Language Compliance Review. I have a scheduled inspection for the Meridian operation, Foreign Document Accuracy Audit under the Import Standards Framework." She said it with the precise level of bureaucratic confidence that communicated, "I do this constantly and find it mildly boring," which was the specific register that made front desk personnel stop asking questions. "I'll need access to your commercial document processing area and a workspace for approximately 2 hours." The receptionist looked at the badge. She looked at Serena. She picked up a phone. Serena waited. She kept her hands easy at her sides. She kept her face at the expression of someone who had 17 other facilities to inspect this week and was trying to be pleasant about the scheduling. A man appeared from a door behind the reception desk. 50s, compact, the face of someone who had learned to be unreadable a long time ago. This was Testa. He looked at the badge. He looked at her. He looked at the badge again with the specific attention of someone who was not checking whether it was real, but whether it was expected. "We weren't notified of a scheduled review," he said. "These inspections are unannounced under the current federal compliance framework," Serena said, with the mild, slightly apologetic authority of someone delivering information that is inconvenient but non-negotiable. "I can provide the regulatory reference if you'd like to verify." She opened the briefcase and produced a document, real, formatted correctly, referencing actual federal code, and set it on the desk. Testa looked at it. He was calculating. She could see it happening behind his face, the same way she could see calculation happen behind defendants' faces in federal courtrooms. The rapid assessment of cost versus benefit, the measurement of how much resistance was worth the attention it would draw. An unannounced federal compliance inspector who had real documentation and a legitimate badge was either exactly what she said she was or something significantly worse. And significantly worse meant calling someone, which meant explaining why there was a problem, which meant admitting what was in the building's residential section. The calculation resolved. "I'll need to see your agency credentials in addition to the field badge," he said. She produced them. Also real. She'd looked at them in the car and had a brief, disorienting moment of understanding that Damiano had been building this particular contingency for long enough that the credentials had an issue, date of 8 months ago. Testa made a call. Low voice, turned slightly away from her. She caught 3 words: standard procedure, federal, documentation, and the rest was below the level she could resolve. He ended the call. "I'll have someone take you to the processing area." She followed a young man in a logistics company polo shirt through the door behind reception, down a corridor that smelled like paper and toner and the particular institutional air of a building that processed a lot of documentation and not much else. The processing area was on the first floor, a large open room with workstations and filing systems and the organized, impersonal feel of real administrative work. Because it was real. The cover operation was genuinely functional, which was how it had stayed operational for this long. She sat down at the inspection workstation the young man designated and opened her briefcase and produced her inspection materials. And then she began to work. Not pretending to work, actually working. Because the documentation in front of her was real commercial paperwork, and her job for the next portion of this was to be exactly what her badge said she was, thoroughly enough that anyone watching would see a federal language inspector doing a federal language inspection. She worked for 23 minutes. She made notes. She flagged 2 documents with minor inaccuracies, genuine ones, because the paperwork wasn't perfectly maintained. She used the inspection protocol exactly as it was designed to be used. And while she worked, she listened. The building had 2 floors. The processing area occupied most of the first floor. The second floor, based on the footprint she'd registered when she walked in, had approximately 4 rooms. The stairwell she'd passed on the way in had a security door at the top, card access, not keyed, which meant electronic, which meant it had been added after the building's original construction, the residential section. At the 26-minute mark, she asked the young man who was sitting at a nearby desk, pretending to file things, whether there was a restroom she could use. He pointed her back toward the corridor. She walked to the corridor. She walked past the restroom. She walked to the base of the stairwell. She looked at the security door at the top. She looked at the keypad. She thought about the layout Russo's document had described: the residential section, accessed via the secondary stairwell, card access door, 2 rooms on the eastern side of the second floor. She went back to the restroom. She used it. She washed her hands. She looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. The charcoal blazer, the hair pinned back, the face that had been keeping itself together for the last 4 days on approximately 9 hours of total sleep. She looked tired. She looked like exactly what she was, a person who had gone further than she'd planned and had not yet found the floor. She walked back to the inspection workstation. At the 40-minute mark, Testa reappeared. He stood near the doorway and watched her work for approximately 90 seconds without speaking, which was the kind of observation that was meant to be felt. Serena flagged another document and wrote a notation and did not look up until she'd finished writing it. "Finding much?" Testa said. "Standard discrepancies, nothing actionable yet." She set down her pen and looked at him with the mild professional gaze she'd been using since she walked in. "I'll need to cross-reference the secondary documentation archive before I can close out the inspection. Is that accessible from this floor?" "What secondary archive?" "Commercial correspondence files. Foreign language vendor communications. The framework requires me to verify that all external correspondence meets the accuracy standard, not just the processed documents." She produced a page from the inspection protocol, a real page specifying a real requirement. "It's usually housed separately from the processing area. Upper floor, in my experience." Testa looked at the page. He looked at her. She held his gaze with the expression of someone who has a regulatory requirement and a schedule and would prefer to complete this without inconvenience to either party. "Those files are in storage," he said. "I'd need to have someone pull them." "That's fine. I can wait." He looked at her for a beat longer. Then he took out his phone and stepped into the corridor. She heard nothing from the call. He came back in 2 minutes. "Someone will bring the files down. It'll be about 15 minutes. "That's fine," she said again. He stayed in the doorway. The 15 minutes were the longest 15 minutes she had experienced since the 4 minutes she'd spent sitting with her phone after the call from the Southern Province Voice, deciding not to call the police. She worked. She made notations. She kept her breathing even and her hands steady, and the expression of mild professional engagement exactly where it needed to be. At the 12-minute mark, she heard something from the floor above. Not loud, not dramatic. A door, and then footsteps on the stairwell that had more than one person's weight in them, and then voices. Low, quick, the kind of exchange that happens when something has changed and needs to be managed. Testa heard it too. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. Something in his face reorganized. Not fear, not exactly, but the recalibration that happens when a situation has revealed a different shape than anticipated. He looked at Serena. She was writing a notation and did not look up. He walked out of the room. Serena set down her pen. She counted to 10. Then she stood, picked up her briefcase, and walked to the corridor. Testa was at the base of the stairwell, speaking rapidly into his phone, his back to her. The young man in the polo shirt had disappeared somewhere. She walked past Testa toward the front of the building, moving at the pace of someone heading to the restroom again. Unhurried, unremarkable. At the front corridor, she stopped. She pressed the transmitter. It was a small thing, a button on the inside of her briefcase handle, which Russo had identified for her with the same flat efficiency with which he'd provided everything else. She pressed it once, held it for 2 seconds, released. 3 blocks east, something would happen. She walked back toward the processing area. She passed the door to the stairwell, which Testa had left partially ajar in his urgency. She stopped. She looked at the door. She looked at the stairwell beyond it, and the security door at the top, which was currently propped open with what appeared to be someone's shoe, the kind of improvised detail that happens when people are moving quickly and can't be bothered with card access on every pass. She walked up the stairs. The second floor was a corridor with 4 doors. The eastern side had 2. She could hear voices from behind the second one, agitated, male, rapid Italian with the southern compression she'd heard on the phone 4 nights ago. The first door was unlocked. She opened it. The room was small. A cot. A window with the blinds down. A woman sitting on the cot with her hands in her lap and her head up, which told Serena something about the kind of person she was. Not cowering, just waiting, conserving. Bianca Valenti was 28 years old, according to the case file. She had her brother's coloring, the dark hair, the settled quality, but her face was younger and currently marked by 4 days of fear that she was visibly refusing to perform for anyone. She looked at Serena. "Who are you?" she said in Italian. "Someone your brother sent," Serena said in Sicilian, because if there was ever a moment to use the language that carried the information of "I'm from where you're from, I know who you are," this was it. Bianca's breath went out of her, one long exhale, like something she'd been holding for 4 days. "Is he here?" she said. "3 blocks east. We need to go now." Bianca stood. She had shoes on. She'd kept her shoes on, which was another thing that told Serena something. She picked up nothing else because there was nothing else to pick up. They went to the door. The voices from the second eastern room had gotten louder. Serena could make out the content now. Someone had seen something outside on the street, and the person on the phone was giving instructions that involved the words "move her" and "now." They went into the corridor. The stairwell door was at the end, 20 feet. A door opened behind them. Serena turned. A man she'd never seen. Not Testa. Someone younger, with the specific physical presence of someone whose professional function was not administrative, was standing in the corridor looking at her with the flat, rapid assessment she recognized from 3 days of watching Damiano read rooms. He said in Italian, "Who are you?" She held up the briefcase. The federal badge was still visible on its exterior. "Language Compliance Inspector. I was directed up here to access the secondary archive files." He looked at the badge. He looked at Bianca. He knew who Bianca was. His hand moved toward his jacket. The building's front windows exploded inward. Not a bomb. Nothing structural. Just the percussion of a vehicle hitting the front facade at speed, which produced the sound and vibration of something much larger and gave the man in the corridor exactly 1 second of full-body reorientation toward the noise. Serena grabbed Bianca's wrist and ran. Down the stairwell, which was shaking from the impact below, and through the ground floor corridor, and past the processing room where filing cabinets had shifted and papers were on the floor, and toward the back of the building because the front was no longer an option. There was a rear exit. She'd clocked it when she came in, a fire door at the end of the back corridor, because she'd learned 4 days ago that you always identify the second way out. She hit the bar on the door, and they were outside in the service alley behind the building, in the cold air and the pale early evening light, and Bianca was running beside her without being told to and without slowing down. A vehicle came around the corner of the alley. Serena stopped. Bianca stopped. The furniture man was driving. The door opened. They got in. "Touch it. The vehicle moved west and then north, and then in a pattern that Serena stopped tracking because tracking it was not her job anymore. And the body she'd been managing for 4 days was starting to send signals that it was going to present its bill shortly and would not be accepting extensions. Bianca sat beside her in the back seat and said nothing for the first several minutes. She was doing what Serena recognized as the internal accounting that happens after a period of sustained fear, checking the inventory of what had happened, what was real, what had been lost. At some point, Bianca said quietly, "He actually did it?" "He's been doing it for 8 months, Serena said. Bianca looked at her. "You know him. I translate for him." "That's not what I mean." Serena looked out the window. "No," she said. "I suppose it's not." They met Damiano at a location she was not given in advance. A warehouse space in a light industrial district north of the city that was empty except for Russo, 2 other men she'd never been introduced to, and Damiano himself, who was standing near the center of the space with his jacket off and his phone in his hand when the vehicle pulled in. He crossed the space in about 4 strides when the door opened. Bianca got out first. He put his arms around her and held her with the specific, complete quality of someone who has spent a significant portion of the last several days engaged in the activity of not thinking about all the ways this moment might not have happened. He held her for a long time. Serena got out of the vehicle. She stood to the side with her briefcase, which she was still carrying because she hadn't put it down since Cicero, and her hands had not yet received the message that they could. When Damiano stepped back from Bianca, he looked at her. His face was different, not reorganized, not recalibrated, actually different, like whatever had been maintaining the surface for the last 4 days had been quietly stood down, and what was underneath it was just a person. He looked at Serena for a long moment. She set the briefcase down. The transmitter worked, she said, because she needed to say something that was about the logistics, and not about the things she could see in his face. The transmitter worked, he confirmed. Novak. Webb picked her up at 5:41. Someone above Webb's pay grade had apparently been building a parallel investigation into the Oversight Coordinating Office for the last 3 months. The Agrigento placement. He paused. The timing was fortunate. You knew, she said, about the parallel investigation. He was quiet for a beat. I knew there was one. I didn't know how far along it was. But you knew they were watching Novak. I knew there was a possibility that if Novak moved on me in the proceeding, it would accelerate a timeline that was already in progress. He looked at his hands. It was not a certainty. It was a gamble. Serena looked at him. And I was part of the gamble. No. He said it without hesitation. You were never part of a plan. You were the reason the plan didn't fall apart when everything else did. The warehouse was quiet. Bianca had sat down on a folding chair near Russo and was drinking water from a bottle someone had produced. The 2 men she didn't know had moved to the building's periphery. Serena picked up the briefcase. She set it back down. She pressed her left hand flat against her thigh and felt the paper through the fabric. The folded page she'd moved from her blazer pocket to her skirt pocket at some point in Cicero and had not yet removed. 51 people, she said. 51. As of tonight. Where do they go? Federal processing, through channels that aren't connected to the Oversight Office. Dana Park is handling it. She was Webb's person, not Novak's. The placements will be legitimate and sealed at the judicial level. He paused. It'll take 3 weeks to finalize. And the Agrigento network. The financial records I provided to Webb, the full set, which I hadn't released yet, went to the prosecutorial team tonight. Everything, trafficking ledgers, payment records, names. He said it flat, without satisfaction. There's nothing left to protect, which means there's nothing left to leverage. The families that were using those networks are going to spend the next several years destroying each other trying to avoid prosecution. And you. He looked at her. What happens to you, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The cooperation agreement. Federal identity. Somewhere that isn't connected to anything I've been connected to. He paused. I'm told it involves agricultural property. Agricultural? Vineyards, specifically. In the southern Mediterranean. The corner of his expression shifted. The ghost of something that was headed toward a smile but hadn't fully committed. I don't know anything about vineyards. You'll learn, she said. The silence that followed was different from any of the silences she'd catalogued over the last 4 days. Not the loaded silence of the courtroom, not the calculating silence of the conference room, not the dangerous silence of the corridor in Cicero. This one was just quiet. The building settling, the temperature dropping as evening came in around the edges of the walls. What do you do now? He asked. She thought about it honestly. I don't know, she said. I was a federal court interpreter. That position is probably not available to me in the same way anymore. Because of what you did. Because of what I became. She looked at the briefcase. The glass thing. I told myself for 11 years that I was the glass, transparent, non-interfering, just carrying the words from one place to another. And now? She looked up. Now I think I was wrong about what glass does. I thought it was passive. It's not. Glass decides what gets through and what doesn't, what's in focus and what isn't. She paused. I just hadn't admitted that to myself before. He was watching her with the look she'd first seen in the emptied courtroom 4 days ago. Not appraising, not calculating, just present, actually paying attention. Rosa Ferraro, she said. She's with the others? She's with the others. She knows now. About the facility, about what it actually was. He paused. She took it better than I expected. People are more resilient than you plan for, Serena said. Sometimes, he said. Sometimes they're less. She picked up the briefcase. This time she didn't put it down. I should go. Where? I don't know that either. She looked at Bianca, who was talking quietly to Russo, who for the first time in 4 days did not have the expression of a man managing a catastrophe. I'll figure it out. She walked toward the warehouse door. Serena. She stopped. She turned around, because this time she wanted to. He was standing where she'd left him, jacket still off, in the specific, unglamorous light of an industrial warehouse, and he looked like someone who had put down a weight that he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten it was separate from him. Say it again, he said, quietly. In Sicilian. She looked at him, and for the first time since she'd said it in an empty courtroom 4 days ago, she understood that the insult she'd aimed at him had been only half right. He had been a prince. He had built a kingdom, even if it was the wrong kind, even if it was made of the wrong materials. And he had spent 8 months dismantling it brick by brick because he'd decided that what was inside it mattered more than the structure itself. That wasn't arrogance. That was the opposite of arrogance. That was the hardest thing. No, she said, gently. I don't think I will. Something in his face understood this. He nodded once. She pushed the door open and walked out into the evening, and the Chicago cold came at her one more time. The lake on the air, the city in the distance, the sky doing the thing October skies did when the light went out of them, going all those colors that couldn't decide between one thing and another. She stood in the parking lot for a moment with the briefcase at her side. She thought about her grandmother's kitchen, about a dialect that carried centuries in its vowels, about a language that had been used for secrets and insults and survival, and was tonight, in an industrial warehouse north of the city, being used for something else. She thought about glass and lenses, and what it meant to let light through versus deciding where it went. She walked to the street. She did not call a car immediately. She stood on the sidewalk and breathed the cold air, and let herself be still for the first time in 4 days. Really still, not the managed stillness of the conference room, but the actual kind. The kind that meant nothing was required of her body, or her face, or her professional neutrality for exactly this moment. A car passed, then another. The city went about its business the way cities do, indifferent and continuous. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A message from a number she didn't have saved. The text was in Sicilian. 3 words. Vi ringrazio sinceramente. I thank you sincerely. Old form. The kind her grandmother used. She stood on the sidewalk and read it twice. She didn't answer it. Not yet. She put the phone in her pocket and picked up the briefcase and started walking in the direction of the train station, because the train was how she got places, had always been how she got places, and some things you kept even when everything else changed. She walked 6 blocks before she realized she was smiling, not performing it, not managing it, just doing it, the way you breathe because something in the body decides it needs to, and the rest of you finds out afterward. She was tired in a way she had no previous reference for. She had done something in the last 4 days that had no name in the professional vocabulary she'd built over 11 years, and it was going to take time to understand what it had cost her and what, if anything, it had made her. But 51 people were somewhere safe tonight, and a woman named Rosa Ferraro knew what was real. And a man who had ruled through fear for 15 years was going to learn something about vineyards. And somewhere in the Chicago night, in a language that carried the weight of centuries, a word had been spoken not as an insult or a warning or a test, just as a truth. And she had answered it, not with words, with everything she'd done since. She walked into the train station. She bought a ticket. She sat down on the bench and set the briefcase on her lap and looked at the arrivals board and waited for the train that would take her home, to the apartment where Mrs. Colucci would eventually knock and offer her something to eat, and call her Bambina and ask no questions about where she'd been, because Mrs. Colucci had lived 81 years and knew that some stories needed to settle before they could be told. The board flipped. Her train was 4 minutes out. She opened her notepad, the same one she'd brought to the courthouse 4 days ago, now almost completely full, and turned to the last blank page. She uncapped her pen. She sat for a moment, Then she wrote one sentence, in the dialect that had started everything, in the handwriting that nobody else could read. Sometimes the strongest weapon is the one nobody notices. She looked at it. She capped the pen. The train arrived. She picked up the briefcase and walked toward it, and the platform lights caught the edges of things and made them briefly bright. And then she was on the train, and the doors closed, and the city began to move past the windows in the particular way it did at night. All lit edges and dark intervals, all the things visible and the spaces between them where everything else lived. She did not look at her phone. She did not make plans. She let the train carry her, and she breathed, and outside the window Chicago went past doing what cities do, holding everything at once, the beautiful and the brutal and the 51 quiet lives beginning somewhere in it tonight. And Serena Belandi, who had spent 11 years being the glass, sat back in her seat and let herself for the first time simply be the person holding it. The train moved on. The night held. And the language that had once carried secrets now carried nothing but the sound of someone finally, and without apology, arriving.